with very interesting titles for their presentations. We begin with Professor Aleksandra Kustra-Rogatka. She teaches theory of law and state at the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun, Poland. And today she will elaborate on the hypocrisy of populist constitutionalism between the façade rhetoric of popular constitutionalism and the actual abuse of counter-majoritarian institutions in Poland. Professor Rogatka, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well? Because I always say yes, great.
Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank organizers for inviting me. It was really it is a pleasure to be here with all participants, and I must say that these 2 days are really very interesting, and the discussions are fascinating. So thank you very much for this. And I would say that being in the last panel has advantages and disadvantages. First of all, I would say about advantages, because I have learned a lot, and I can put some pieces to my presentation, I guess. On the other hand, a lot has been already said, so I don't want to say one more time the same. Thank you very much for reading the very long title of my presentation, and I apologize for not sending the paper yet. It is in a very draft form, so I didn't want to send it in such a form, and I will do it as soon as I will have it in a, let's say, a little bit more polished form. I would start with some doubts about the title, because my title is about counter-majoritarian institutions, but in the paper I elaborate about 3 institutions: Constitutional Court, which is of course the counter-majoritarian body. But I also analyzed the current situation of Supreme Court, which is a judicial body, so it can be also defined as counter-majoritarian. But I decided also to add the ombudsman. And when I was writing the title of an abstract of this paper, I wasn't aware what will be the current situation. I had some forecasts, let's say, but you never know if they will be true. So it turned out that they are, let's say, they turned out to be true, and it is the third body of, I would say, constitutional democracy, which is being taken over by right-wing populists in Poland. So probably in my paper, I will change the title, and I will rather use the broader concept of constitutional democracy rather than counter-majoritarian institutions. That's just one point about the title. In the paper, I elaborated a lot about the concept of populism, but it has been said a lot about it within these 2 days, so I don't want to take my time. I will just say that it is a very, very diverse phenomenon, populism, constitutionalism, as we can see it from our discussions, among others. And I really like this thing. I really like what Professor Gabriel Halmai did, because he distinguished 2 concepts of populism, good and bad, and it is a reference to to the concept of Isaiah Berlin, true and false populism. And in the case of Polish populism, if we can call the law and justice politics as populist politics, it is definitely the false or bad one. It is simply the authoritarian populism. And my paper is about the rhetoric, yes, but the rhetoric as a starting point, because I try to analyze the dissonance between the pure rhetorics and political facts. Populists often appeal to popular sovereignty and also to idea of popular constitutionalism, or even in broader terms to political constitutionalism. So they focus on popular sovereignty, and they believe that the people is a unit, so representation serves as a tool to give voice to the unity. And while in theory, this should mean an emphasis on institution of, for example, direct democracy, in practice, at least in the case of Poland, there is this dissonance between the rhetorics of popular constitutionalism and political actions of authoritarian populists. So the supreme power is identified with the parliament, but as the process of taking over the institutions of constitutional democracy is continues, then they began to play important and or sometimes even the key role in shaping politics. And that's the clue of my presentation. That's the main thesis of the presentation. I would like to say just a little bit about the genesis of the populism in Poland. So you probably know that the main party of the current coalition, the Law and Justice Party, had already been a member of ruling coalition in 2005 and 2007. However, the parliamentary crisis led to an early parliamentary elections in 2007. But back in 2005 and 2007, already Law and Justice had used the slogan of building a fourth republic, and it postulated many very fundamental changes in Polish political system. For example, they criticized the whole, let's say, the foundations of the Third Republic. This is how we call Polish state in the Constitution of 1997. Going back to the ruling coalition by winning the elections, parliamentary elections in 2015, gave them, let's say, the second chance to implement their ideas. However, this is the main difference between Poland and Hungary. They didn't get the supermajority, so they couldn't change the constitution. So they, what did Kaczynski as the main brain, let's say, of Law and Justice Party? Probably he decided that he will put aside the bill of many constitutional amendments, so they were prepared, and we were aware about them. But he was aware that it's simply impossible to get the majority, the constitutional majority. So he decided to change the political system by statute law. And this concept or this practice was very aptly described by two of my colleagues, by Maciej Bernat and Michał Ziłkowski, and in one of their academic pieces they called it statutory anti-constitutionalism. So maybe it is even not constitutionalism, it is anti-constitutionalism, and statutory laws are weapons or tools used against the constitution, and therefore Kaczyński had to focus on the Article 4 of the Polish Constitution, which constitutes the supreme power of the Polish nation. And according to Article 4, the nation shall exercise such power directly or through their representatives. Nevertheless, Law and Justice emphasized representative democracy, of course, equating parliamentary decisions with the power of the people. So, as I said, statute law has become the basic tool for introducing systemic changes, often with gross violations of the binding constitutional norms. This, at the same time, the rhetoric of the Law and Justice leaders was aimed at delegitimization of many institutions of constitutional democracy, among others with the counter-majoritarian body, the Constitutional Tribunal, but also courts, among others, the Supreme Court, the Ombudsman, and many others. So they were targets of political attacks. I will not say maybe about the arguments, but I will start with the main analysis in my paper. So I analyze the current political position of these three institutions: Constitutional Tribunal, Supreme Court, and Ombudsman. And I say that each of them plays a different role in the current political situation, and each of them is at the different stage of the gradual taking over by populists. So first of all, since 2015, the Constitutional Court has come a long way from the subject of a brutal attack to a puppet, I would say, in a political spectacle directed by Law and Justice. Then the Supreme Court is still a court which is only partially taken over by politicians. So there is an internal fight between, we call it, old and new chambers. So new chambers were introduced by populists, old chambers are with the independent judges. There is Ombudsman, who's, I would say, in a waiting room for being taken over. The recent case, the recent judgment of 15 April 2021 in the case K20/20 gave the same green light to appoint, at least temporarily, an acting ombudsman, disregarding constitutional norms. Whereas ombudsman is still in a waiting room, I would say that Supreme Court and Constitutional Court are already on the other side. And I know that I don't have time to analyze all three institutions, so I would like to focus on the first one, the counter-majoritarian body, which is Constitutional Court. And there are at least several cases which show that currently Constitutional Court plays the major role in the political life in Poland. So as I said, it has nothing to in common with popular constitutionalism, I would say, which rather dislike the idea of judicial review. But I would like to focus on, well, there are various cases. Some of them are about the EU law. Some of them are about the internal aspects of so-called judicial reforms, but I would like to focus on one case, which is about the abortion law, because I think it is different from others, and I think it in a very vivid way it shows this dissonance between rhetoric and between the real politics. So as you probably know, Poland had very already rather strict abortion law. Abortion was illegal since 1993. There were 3 exceptions from this in 3 cases, and in the judgment of the Constitutional Court of 22nd of October 2020, the Constitutional Court declared one of these 3 exceptions, the so-called embryo pathological exception, unconstitutional. And I would say that by applying this exception, almost 90% of legal abortions were done in Poland. So the other 2 were not about. I would say that they were rather used in theory, not in practice. So the judgment, you probably also know that it caused largest mass protests in Poland since political transition in 1989. And despite the COVID pandemic, hundreds of thousands of people have been protesting against the ruling. And I think that politicians weren't aware that it will cause such a rage of a society. So one of these symptoms of the political panic was the fact that the judgment was published only 3 months after it was issued. But what I want to say is that the radical right-wing circles have already tried several times to have to narrow the exceptions to the abortion ban. However, they lacked political clout to pass such a bill. So the last of these legislative attempts still lurked in the so-called parliamentary freezer when the judgment was passed. And I think that this shows that the constitutional court turned out to be a very convenient tool for the lower justice to implement their policy while keeping their hands clean. So it shows that populists appeal to the idea of popular constitutionalism or political constitutionalism, but in reality they take over various institutions of constitutional democracy. And well, this is maybe this fact is maybe well known, I would say, because, for example, Miller said that populists are not generally against institutions. They are not designed to self-destruct once in power. They only oppose those institutions that, in their view, fail to produce the morally as opposed to empirically correct political outcomes. And that happens only when they are in opposition. Populists in power are fine with institutions, which is to say their institutions. One thing is to have their institutions, yes, or I would say your institution. But the other hand, the totally different thing is to, I would say, overuse these institutions. And the case of abortion law in Poland shows that it was quite obvious overuse, because politicians, populists wanted to implement their, I would say, radical ideological policies, but they also wanted to avoid the political accountability, and they wanted to have their hands clean. This is, I think, the most vivid case with regard to the the Constitutional Court, although there are some others, but they are more subtle. With regard to a Supreme Court and Ombudsman as the bodies of constitutional democracy, it is more complicated. Yes, it's the situation is more complex. I don't want to elaborate about this because I lack of my time. So I would only say that the general strategy is the same. So simply the Constitutional Court is already on the other side. Supreme Court is, I would say, still in an internal fight, and probably this fight will take quite a long time. And with Ombudsman, I would say that probably within 3 months we'll have new Ombudsman, and it will be turned into a let's say propaganda tube of right-wing populists in Poland. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. It would worth it if we dedicate a session on populism and patriarchy, because what you face up with in Poland is a discussion also in Greece and elsewhere, but the right to abortion. Thank you very much. Now we move on to our next panelist, also a woman, Dr. Alexianna Tsotsou. Mrs. Tsotsou holds a PhD in Discourse Analysis and Media Linguistics from the University of Hamburg, and she has studied philology, theoretical and applied linguistics, and law. Today, she will present us the paper, The Discursive Strategies of Populist Rhetoric in Greece, a linguistic approach to populist constitutionalism in the context of critical discourse analysis. Alexianna, we listen to you now.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Can you hear me? It is okay? Can you see my...
Yes, it's
can
okay.
You see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it, everything.
Okay. Thank you. So today I will speak about the discursive strategies of populist rhetoric in Greece. It is a linguistic approach. So the aim of my study is to analyze the discursive practices in the Greek language in the various forms of populism, whose central subject is the constitution and the need to change it in text whose main subject is that. And this analysis helps to show how key features of populist discourse
Alexianna, we cannot hear you.
To deconstruct institutions. And
Alexianna, can you hear me? We can hear you now, but you will have to repeat the last minute because we couldn't.
Sorry. The internet connection is okay, but I don't know why you can hear me. So the aim of my study is to analyze discursive practices in the Greek language, and the text have as a subject the constitution and the need to change it. And this analysis can help to show how key features of populist discourse, such as the attempt to deconstruct institutions and the division between the pure people and the corrupt elite, are linguistically realized. So the broader goal is to understand the populist phenomenon in a wide political spectrum, and to determine by which linguistic tools its varieties and the similarities and differences of the varieties of populist phenomenon are communicated. So discourse analysis with its systematic qualitative analysis of the text enables the description and categorization of the dissimilar types of populism, not only in terms of content, but also at the level of structure and form. And so my study is based on critical discourse analysis, which describes and explains the discursive strategies which reproduce ideologies and associate discourse with its political and social context. So according to critical discourse analysis, the relationship between discourse and context is dialectical. So the discourse is not only a representation of the social and political conditions, but also it has the power to influence them. My study is based on a discourse historical approach of critical discourse analysis. This approach studies the discursive strategies that use specific linguistic tools to achieve linguistic, political, and social goals. A goal is to represent the positive representation of the in-group and the negative representation of the out-group. And this distinction between in-group and out-group is a key feature of populist discourse. So in populist discourse, we see that there are many strategies that positively construct the we group and negatively the group of others to which the elites belong. And I studied the nomination and predication strategies in my paper. These strategies show which facts, procedures, and actors are named in discourse and how they are characterized, positively or negatively. So regarding my data, I will be brief. You can see everything you need to know in my paper. I studied a text from political parties in the Greek language. So it's political discourse. I want to study political discourse. So I have text from independent Greeks, the Pan-European movement DiEM25, the Communist Party of Greece, and an article and a speech from George Katrougalos, who is a constitutional expert, but also it was then a member of the European Parliament with Syriza. The criterion for the selection of the text is the negative characterization of the current constitution, and they reference the need for a radical revision of the constitution so that a new constitution can better and more effectively express popular sovereignty. So there are some common features in all texts. First of all, I have observed that there is a Manichaean dichotomy between the in-group, which is positively characterized, and the out-group, which is negatively characterized. The out-group is constituted by the elites, and thus we see the anti-elitist approach of the populists, and among them is the constitution in all texts. According to the language tools in the text, it is observed often a generic reference to the actors. The generic reference, according to the theory of social actors, is the linguistic tool by which the social and political actors are presented as a single and homogeneous group. So there is the result that the characteristics of a member of a group are attributed to all members of these groups. Consequently, the simplistic mechanism of dividing the world into good and bad actors is achieved, and the enormous diversity that exists even among members of the same group is silent. So we see a sentence, political elites who have put their own interests above the well-being of the Europeans. It is a sentence of the movement DiEM25. So in this sentence, there is an out-group to which belong all the political elites. And there is all the Europeans who constitute the in-group. So there is a human dipole between the good Europeans and the bad, rich and powerful people. There are also metaphors of hostility and war between the two groups. Metaphors are used in various ways in populist rhetoric, since in addition to vivid and graphic narration, they also serve another characteristic of populism, simplification. So we see that there is a common point in all metaphors used in the discourse. There is the relationship between the political and social actors is perceived in terms of hostility and war between two opposing groups. On the one hand is the ruling class group, and it is the enemy, and on the other hand is the group, the in-group, the familiar group, which fights against it. There are some examples, but I don't have the time to read them, so you can read them all in my paper. So in the text of independent Greeks, to the in-group belong the Greek people. The movement of independent Greeks belongs to the right-wing populism, but the objective of the text is to stigmatize the economic policy of Memorandum of Understanding in Greece in 2012, and not to enter into issues of immigration, purity of the nation. So we don't see this kind of argumentation. There is a use of first plural person. So we are many, we are independent, we are Greeks. This is a slogan, the motto of the party. And the reader can decide if this we is inclusive, it includes him or her, or exclusive, it does not include him or her. But in the case that the reader does not join the party and therefore is not included in the in-group, the logical conclusion emerges that he or she does not belong to the Greek people. The identification between the people and the specific party is clear. In the out-group are being categorized the actors responsible for the austerity economic policy in Greece. And there is also direct reference to the need for a radical revision of the constitution. So the example is a fundamental change in the constitutional and administrative legal framework is required. So this revision of the constitution is expressed as a condition and a means to achieve the party's goals, such as the treatment of the Greek debt. And it is implied that the current constitution, if not responsible for the bad situation of the country, is at least tolerant and unable to overthrow it. In the pan-European movement, DiEM25, the in-group consists of the European Democrats, and there's a generic reference that presents them as a coherent group, with the element of democracy giving homogeneity to the similar group. So the example is DiEM25 is the infrastructure that all European Democrats or of political persuasions will use. That implies that the existing status quo in Europe is not democratic. And the outgroup consists of all the existing institutions that we see the anti-elitism. The opposition to the constitution does not refer to a revision, but to the need for the existence of a new constitution with specific characteristics. Our long-term vision is for European citizens to write a democratic constitution for the European Union. So the movement refers to the gap that exists, as no European treaty has so far been considered an EU constitution. And this the composition of the constitution in Europe is reflected as a vision, and therefore the ultimate goal of the movement, and not just a means to achieve other goals. And this goal is part of a more general alteration, which is named in different ways: New European Agreement, etc. In the text of the Communist Party of Greece, there is an escalation in terms of the actors that belong to the in-group. The basic position of the party is that it represents the working class, but there's a tendency to expand the in-group. This expansion is achieved on the basis of the division between capital and employees. So there is two sentences that are representative: all those who suffer from the power of capital, and the big capital that wants to speculate even more than before. It is not worth that in the second sentence, the outgroup actors are named impersonally with a noun of a neuter gender, capital. But at the same time, this word takes the place of a subject in active voice structure, and with the use of verbs that require human action, such as want, speculate. In the outgroup is explicitly categorized the 1975 Constitution, to which are attributed negatively characterizations with adjectives and relative sentences, as well as rhetorical devices of exaggeration and emotionally charged word with negative connotation. Conservative reactionary constitution, you can see the example. It is noteworthy that much more emphasis is placed on the negative characterization of the current constitution than on the need to revise or replace it with a new one. This is because the abolition or revision of the constitution is part of the general dismantling of existing institutions and the broader goal of building a state which explicitly opposes liberal democracy. So they say that the strategic goal of the Communist Party of Greece is the conquest of the revolutionary worker, etc. So since there's a goal for the major, that is regime change, there's no reason to discuss the minor, that is how to improve an institution of a regime that is rejected altogether. In the text of, in the article and speech of George Katrougalos, a member of European Parliament with Syriza, the main subject of the text is the constitutional change. So both in and out group are built around the dipole of the old and the new constitution. The new constitution is positively mentioned as the citizens' constitution, in a language contrasting with the 1975 constitution, which is described as the constitution of the professional politics. And this simplistic and sloganic linguistic expression is consistent with the Manichaean dichotomy found in populist discourse between good and evil. The outgroup extends beyond the existing constitution and includes also political and economic elites. These elites are named with generic reference as a homogeneous group, which has the common features that this system governs the country. It is a compact system that governs the country, and in this system, it is implied that the people cannot participate. It is also noteworthy that we see an instrumental treatment of the constitution, as this appears to be a victim of the outgroup actions. The constitution was one of the first victims of the memorandum. So on the one hand, the argument of the text is based on the need to adopt a new constitution. Thus, it is implied that the current constitution cannot serve the people and their interests. On the other hand, the constitution, the current constitution of 1975, is invoked in order for the negative effects of the actions of the outgroup to be seen more convincingly. The adoption of a new constitution constitutes a clear goal that is reflected in the text, but at the same time, it is the means for a complete reform of the political system. And also, the texts provide a procedure for the adoption of a new constitution. Only these texts give a procedure of how we can adopt a new constitution. And that it is expected, as the texts are on the border between political and academic discourse, as they come from a politician, but also in constitutional experts. So it is expected to proceed in more technical details. So we see that there are many similarities in the discursive construction of outgroup. In all texts, the outgroup is constituted by the elites and the current constitution. A common linguistic tool is a generic reference that builds the dichotomy between good and bad actors. But there are also some differences in the discursive construction of the in-group. Depending on the political position of the party, the in-group may include the Greek nations, as in independent Greeks, the European Democrats, as in the M25, the employees suffering from capital, as in Communist Party of Greece, or people, as in Syriza. There are also differences in the position that the adoption of a new constitution has in the argumentation of the text. So the constitutional change can be the means to achieve goals that have nothing to do with the improvement of the regime, as reflected in the text of independent Greeks. So independent Greeks say that the revision of the constitutional framework is a precondition to achieve other economic goals. The constitutional change can also be an end in itself, to fill a gap, as in the M25. On the other hand, the enactment of a new constitution can be an independent goal and at the same time a means of building a new form of regime, as in the text of Communist Party of Greece and Syriza. But there are also differences between them. The Communist Party of Greece says that the constitutional aims at a form of state that is far away from liberal democracy. Syriza, on the other hand, argues in favor of democracy, but wants a more direct form of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You took us back some years ago. It is, of course, it's logical that the Constitution would be a part of political dialogue and political pursuit and expectations, but it was very interesting to see how it is used. Thank you very much. So now we stick on to speech, but free speech. We go to Dr. Juha Tapani Tuovinen, I hope I say the name correctly, who holds a PhD in comparative constitutional law and is a postdoc researcher at the Central European University in Budapest, if I'm correct. And he's of free speech. Can you hear me?
You keep cutting out.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just realized. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly now, and
okay, thank you.
Hope that others can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll just continue and flag if there's a problem. Thank you very much, Eleni, and thanks very much to the organizers for organizing what has been a really wonderful conference. And thanks to everyone who's still here listening on a Saturday evening, when I'm sure we all have many other tempting things we would be doing. So yeah, my paper is called Populism and Freedom of Expression. And I'm writing it as part of the Populism and Democratic Defense Group, which is a project at Aarhus University, which is where I've moved to quite recently. I don't know if I sent you the bio when I was still at the CEU, but which was true at the time, but now I'm in Denmark, where we have this project on populism and democratic defense. If it's of interest to some of you, I hope you Google it and you'll find our website and more info on that there. But the paper is sort of rooted on two assumptions, some of which are also relevant to the project, but I'll stick to the paper. The first one is hopefully not too controversial. So the assumption is that populism, or at least some forms of it, may pose a threat to democracy. And I think we've heard plenty of examples of where that is the case. And that sort of gives rise to reasons for protecting democracy from populists. Now the second one, the second sort of assumption which this is rooted in is that the nature of populist parties and populist politicians these days is relatively ambiguous, and it's certainly ambiguous when it comes to their anti-democratic or anti-human rights stances. So if we take kind of the emblematic anti-democratic, anti-human rights, anti-constitutionalist populists, Fidesz and PiS, the Polish one, they are, even though we consider them threats to democracy, and even if they very successfully undermine democracy in their respective countries, they're not openly hostile to democracy. So even today, Fidesz does not say it is an anti-democratic party. It has just come up with this very convoluted idea of Christian democracy that it implements. Now, for those of us who want to protect democracy, this poses a very difficult problem, because sort of ideas of militant democracy, which we have inherited from Karl Löwenstein and those thinkers, sort of are rooted in the presumption that we can detect the enemies of democracy before they come into power. And that just doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So one consequence of this kind of a situation where the threat to the democratic nature of the state is posed by ambiguous actors that you cannot defend democracy against through the sort of traditional means of party bans, is that you start to focus the efforts on sort of democracy adjacent rights. So things that make democracy work. So freedom of expression, which is my topic here, but also party regulation, the regulation of civil society, and those kind of things. Let me take a sip. So that's sort of the background against which I'm working. And the first paper, or the first part of the paper, is almost a preliminary part where I sketch out what the threat to democracy from populist parties is. And I think we often just assume that populists are bad for democracy, and we've heard a lot of pushback against that idea today. But I think there is a need to sort of also tackle populists and the threat that they pose in a little bit more nuance. So I just outline sort of two threats that populists may pose, or two types of threats. So the first threat is that populist policies clash with sort of liberal democratic policies. So what I have in mind are kind of right-wing European populist parties who would enact sort of extremely racist laws or anti-immigrant laws, anti-asylum seeker laws that would then breach human rights. So that's one type of threat. So it's if populists come into power, either themselves or as part of a coalition, they may be able to push through policies that are bad. Maybe this is an obvious point, and then it depends on the strength of the human rights system in the particular state that of how strongly it can push back. But the other type of threat is a sort of systemic threat, and I think here the emblematic cases are Hungary and Poland, where populists have undermined or undone the entire democratic system. They're sort of extreme cases. I think we could also imagine that populists, as part of a coalition, would be able to, for example, influence the appointment of judges or something like that, which would then gradually erode the quality of the democratic governance structures in a state. But even below that, sort of the kind of rhetoric that we often see from populists may very well undermine faith in the authority of institutions. So if you constantly criticize the European Court of Human Rights or the EU or the Constitutional Court or human rights in general, it's, I think, quite plausible that at some point this will start to influence the opinion of large parts of the population. But I think here, this is sort of, like I said, this is a preliminary point. So I want to move away from just thinking of populists as bad and actually sort of see what the actual threats are. So the second part is then where it gets meatier, and I should say that I'm still very much in the process of figuring this out and writing this paper. So feedback on anything is welcome. None of this is set in stone. So part two then analyzes populist communication. So if the question of the paper is how do we defend the democratic state against threats emanating from populists and populist communication, we should take a look at this. And this, I must confess, is totally new to me. I'm a lawyer by training, and now in a political science department. So I read these papers and show them to my colleagues and ask them, like, is my understanding of this remotely correct? And then we try to work them in there. But if I understand it correctly, populist communication is a sort of emerging subfield in the study of populism. And it sort of studies the way in which populists communicate, very much like the paper by Alexianna we just saw right before me. I don't have particularly sophisticated thoughts on this, but I found the work by Jason Stanley to be extremely useful. And I know he writes about fascism and propaganda, but I think he writes about them in such a broad, he has such a broad understanding of them that, that I think they're also useful for those of us who are trying to understand populist communication. He also draws a lot of examples from Hungary, and I think at some point somewhere he said that he started writing on propaganda when he was spending time in Hungary around about, well, just before Orban won his first, well, the second time he won in 2010. So I give you a full sort of treatment, or not a full treatment, but I give you a kind of treatment of his ideas and how they might be relevant to understanding populist communication in the paper. We've seen a lot of the examples. I think the most interesting ones are the ones that sort of hide the true purposes of the populist parties or populist policies and then sell sort of anti-democracy, anti-human rights arguments as something else. So some of the devices that they use for this, we've heard about fear and anger and how much they feature in populist communication. So this is one of the most common one, and you can of course use this to then influence the public opinion. So I think anti-immigrant sentiment and crimes committed by immigrants is a sort of very popular one there. Anti-intellectualism is another one we've heard about already. So when you offer easy answers to complex problems, rather you would prefer if people just applied their common sense and none of this liberal nonsense, university learned, cosmopolitan sort of highbrow theorization. Another interesting one is hierarchies, so the development of hierarchies, so between those who are deserving and those who are undeserving. If you read sort of populist politicians in Northern Europe and what they have to say about Southern Europe and the various EU funds, and it's just crazy, but apparently it works. So my point here is that you get the idea. Populist rhetoric sort of distorts political debate by selling messages that can lead to sort of anti-democratic, anti-human rights, other types of sentiments, without actually appearing as such. And I don't hope nobody thinks that I'm naive about the quality of political discourse in general, but I think there's something particular about the way in which populists use these kind of tools. So I take this, and then the last part, and this is still very, very, very tentative. I look at 4 legal devices and what they can do to kind of counter this populist rhetoric. And here I'm still sort of, I've only just started to sketch out what they might look like. So one sort of traditional one, or the first one I look at, is a sort of traditional bans on extreme speech. So this is already mentioned by Löwenstein as one of the sort of classic devices in which to prevent populism. And there is, I don't know, I think I wasn't expecting much from sort of hate speech prohibitions, etc., because it's so easy to get around them. But if you look at, but I couldn't also find a sort of systematic study of this, of populism and hate speech and whether it influences what they do. And sort of, my glass is half empty in the sense that I don't think it does much to stop many of the things, or it wouldn't catch many of the things that populists say. It's half full in the sense that I think it may be doing the work sort of by not allowing this kind of speech to enter the fray at all, which might well be there if this wasn't the case. The second one had a very brief comment on defamation, which I won't go into. Then more interesting is media regulation. And the media is, of course, crucial to all democracy and all political success. But one of the interesting sort of things I found when reading that literature was to see that there's actually strong incentives to report populist rhetoric, because divisive rhetoric makes people, you know, tune to your channel. So I think if you know of President Trump and Fox News, or then you've seen this kind of in action. And their sort of media policy would need to be rechecked to see if this could be counted somehow. The third is social media, which is also crucial as an integral part of the media these days. And yesterday, was it yesterday or Thursday that we got the Facebook Oversight Board's decision, I think they're called decisions or verdicts, on the Trump ban. I know this is being live streamed on Facebook, so I won't say anything too controversial, but I think it's quite clear that we're talking about a kind of legal gray area there. I haven't had a chance to read the judgment yet, but it seems to me as if no one's really quite sure about what the norms that should be applied are. That now Facebook has sort of voluntarily assumed that it would apply international human rights law, which I must say I'm not too optimistic about, and also a little skeptical about how it can work in the case of a private company, when the laws have been designed for states, and also as a kind of only a minimum for states. So I'm curious as to why Facebook wouldn't push themselves further if they're concerned about the role of political debate. But yeah, I think that brings me very close to the end. This is my sort of very tentative attempt at the moment to connect sort of populism, populist rhetoric, and the various ways in which freedom of expression and the freedom of expression environment is regulated. If anyone has any kind of stories of where, you know, speech by populists has been successfully regulated, please let me know. I'll be eternally grateful. And on that note, I will hand it back to Eleni. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We will elaborate, I believe, in the discussion more on these interesting things you said about free speech in social media, mainly. We pass now to our last but not least speaker for the whole conference, Mr. Alberto Nicotina, who is a PhD candidate in constitutional law at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And I believe he has studied law in the University in Trento. He will elaborate on the impact of populism on EU multi-level governance, political and constitutional strategies. Alberto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me. I will share my screen. Can you see it? Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Indeed, the topic, I will try to be very brief indeed. My topic indeed that I want to present here today is the impact of populism on EU multi-level governance, political and constitutional strategies. I must say that being the last one to speak is very useful because indeed I can integrate what I've heard all along this conference during these 2 days in my presentation. And I have to say that, well, this is my research question. Is it possible to measure and explain the impact of populism in the national constitutional strategies that face multi-level governance? And indeed, during these 2 days, we have heard a lot about what is populist, what is populism as an ideology, as Professor Costas said, and Professor Almai before her. But indeed, my point of view is indeed what is it possible to indeed measure and explain the impact of populist or populist ideology in the national constitutional approach towards multi-level governance. And by multi-level governance, I mean indeed the European Union. So I confine my reflection today to the territory of the European Union. And what I propose to measure and explain the impact of populism is indeed a three-step process. So indeed, in order, from a methodological standpoint, in order to make my point, I will, first of all, define what are political strategies, but it's very, very clear and self-explanatory. But especially, I will rely on the theorization of constitutional strategies in the face of multi-level governance that has been made by a Belgian scholar, Professor Popelier, in 2014. Constitutional strategy in the face of multi-level governance is also my PhD research project, the title of my PhD research project. So these reflections today are part of my PhD research journey. And then I try to define populism, but I will be very brief on this point since a lot has already been said. And then indeed, I will try to divert the ways through which a political strategy, and in particular a populist political strategy, may translate into long change of the constitutional approach towards the EU. I've heard before the exchange between Professor Miskitaseya and Professor Osnay about whether the constitutional setting in a way can help in stopping populism. And I found it very interesting. I'll try to take some of that into it. Well, starting indeed from the theory of constitutional strategies in the face of multi-level governance, basically, Professor Popelier in this article, and the intuition behind this article is that by looking at some selected institutional features of EU member states, it is possible to distinguish member states which are more concerned with giving and removing obstacles to the smooth implementation of EU law international legal order, and other member states which in a way are more concerned with providing a strengthened legitimacy to European claims of supremacy over national law. And so the constitutional strategies can be defined, according to Popelier, as the set of options that a member state develops to meet the challenges brought by the EU multi-level framework. And to outline this strategy are the constitutional actors, which are indeed political constitutional actors, parliament and governance, national and national parliament and governance, and courts. Within my doctoral research, I outlined 4 indicators that you see in this graph, in this table. And these 4 indicators relate to the way in which constitutional actors use their powers, the powers that the Constitution assigned to them, to shape their constitutional strategies and to, in a way, carry out their, let's say, strategic behavior. So I look, for instance, at the requirements, procedural requirements for the ratification of EU treaties. This has, of course, some there's a differentiation, a variation in the member states, how the doctrine of supremacy of EU law is dealt with at the national level, how the parliamentary control over the executives in EU affairs differs from country to country, and whether on the side of the courts, their institutional capacity to challenge EU law on constitutional grounds, so to make evident the clashes, the potential antinomies between national law and supranational law. So by I elaborated this table by giving score to each sub-indicator, and I gave those scores with the following ratio. So a lower score corresponds an efficiency strategy, so no obstacles to the smooth implementation of EU law, and to the highest score correspond point to a legitimacy outcome. On the basis of the results of the empirical analysis I've done in the first part of my research, I can now distinguish, I produced this table in which it is possible to distinguish in red the legitimacy components and in blue the efficiency components in each member state. But I did so, and I carried out this analysis by looking exclusively at the institutional potential, so at the law in the books of what I read in the constitutional texts and on the, let's say, on the side of the court, on the established case law. But indeed, for the purpose of this presentation and my paper, I want to understand through which paths political strategies can affect and can shape a constitutional strategy. So I don't, as I say that, I won't dwell too much on what is populism. We know there's a political strategy, and in my paper I use this definition, which is not by two political scientists, Meyers and Soslov, who carried out an expert survey ranging 250 political parties in all EU member states. And they point out 5 key elements that describe populism, the populist political strategies. So popular sovereignty, as has been said in this conference, should reside with the ordinary people. That is an indivisible and homogeneous community whose interests are united by a general will, and the elite is portrayed as corrupted, and the juxtaposition between the ordinary people and the elite is a Manichaean proportion, that is a moral struggle between good and bad. But as we have heard during this conference, populism is not only a constitutional strategy, a political strategy, but it's also a competing constitutional theory, which is based on some key elements which have been already discussed in this conference: constituent power, popular sovereignty, constitutional identity, and legal resentment. But a point in common that let's say is a key feature of when it comes to the relationship with the European Union of all populist parties is Euroscepticism. And this is well grounded and well established by doctrine in general. I think that when it comes to the relation with the European Union, there are 2 key elements that distinguish the populist agenda. Well, the very first one is the support, and the unconditioned support to EU-related referendums as a means to bring sovereignty back to the people, and the way in which parliamentary oversight of the executive in EU affairs is understood. So the so-called watchdog behavior. There is an extensive knowledge available and published on the behavior of populist parties during the elections, populist communication styles, as we have just heard, but there is very little studies, empirical studies, on the actual parliamentary behavior of populist party once they have gained parliamentary seats. But there is a study in particular by Lauwers and Ochis that studied the Dutch parliament over more than 20 years, and they concluded that populist parties are more likely to engage in scrutiny behavior compared to non-populist ones. So on the one side, we see an unconditioned supported for referendum, which is indeed witnessed by the 2016 Brexit referendum. A lot of studies, and again empirical studies, point out that referendum was can be understood as a populist enterprise. And on the other side, we have this watchdog behavior. So I take into account these two key elements of the populist agenda, and I developed, let's say, a 3-step method to measure the impact of populism on EU multi-level governance. So first of all, the first step is considering the institutional, what I call the institutional potential. So look at the law in the books and what the law says about the powers granted to constitutional actors. Then considering the political practice, in what way and if it varies compared to the institutional potential within a given member state and within a given time frame, and then observing this spread through qualitative empirical legal methods. For instance, a good one might be country reports by national experts. And in this way, I can very briefly, and to close here my presentation, demonstrate some let's say, empirical evidences that demonstrate how this model might work. So if we take, for example, the United Kingdom, we see that the EU referendum was not required by the legal text, but it wasn't even prohibited. So there was a political push towards the call of EU referendum, and indeed it was not prohibited, then it could take place. But the same thing could have not happened in Italy or in Belgium, for instance, because the referendum, the institutional setting, the constitutional setting explicitly prohibits calling nationwide referendums for specific affairs, namely budget issues, tax issues, or international relations. So even if some political parties, actually there was a discussion yesterday about the 5-star movements in Italy. Yes, indeed, for a long time, they claimed that a referendum to abolish the euro, to go out of the European Union was discussed. But indeed, there is this institutional constraint, Article 75 of the Constitution, that made this political process not having a sequel. It can be followed by anything. But even talking about referendum, we see by looking at the institutional potential, so the law in the books, that in the case of Latvia, for instance, there is an option to call a referendum, which is just an option, but it is explicitly foreseen by the Latvian constitution. But this has not prevented on the side of political practice to ratify on the session of 8 May 2008 the Lisbon Treaty in only 12 minutes. So there was a very, let's say, efficiency strategy style political practice in that case. But when taking into account also the second indicator, so the parliamentary oversight of the executive and affairs, we see that, for instance, in the case of Bulgaria, there is a very strong institutional setting that imposes a scrutiny reserve. So when negotiating EU draft legislation within the EU Council of Ministers, the government of Bulgaria must wait the parliament's issue an opinion. But this in theory, but if we look at the political practice, there is a very low, and studies, qualitative studies about the Bulgarian parliament actually tell us that there is a very low parliamentary control in practice. And at the same, reversely, on the contrary, if you look at the case of the Netherlands, for instance, theoretically, there is a very weak duty to take into account parliamentary opinions, which is not forgotten by further content. But in practice, if you look at the political practice of the Netherlands, of the parliamentary control in EU affairs in the Netherlands, we find out that it is very strong, although the institutional potential is very minimal. So I think that the approach that I just described as some characteristics that can be very briefly mentioned. Well, it is empirically grounded because it's grounded indeed on empirical evidence. It takes into account the populist agenda, so what the theoretical setting of populism wants and claim, rather than taking into account subjective classification and label about parties, so who is populist, who is not populist. It is dynamic insofar it allows for mapping evolution over time, and it is neutral. We have heard, and there are many authors that claim that populism is just a label which is put on the jacket of the political enemies in order to discredit them. Well, I endeavor with this approach just to measure the impact of populism, and the impact is not to be understood as judgment value, as a necessarily a negative impact. It might be a positive impact of populism. I think that we can talk about a positive impact of populism only if we consider constitutional law and constitutional engineering as a way to limit sovereign powers. So in the first wave of affirmation of constitutionalism, it was about limiting the power of the absolute monarchs. But nowadays, it's more about limiting mob rule, the exact opposite of the spectrum. And it's indeed a sovereign power to be limited. So thank you, this was my contribution.
Thank you very much. At last, a good word for the populism, that it can be also positive, not only negative or illiberal. And it can be a neutral, maybe, word. Thank you very much, Alberto. I already have a question for for Alexianna, but the floor is open for any questions from the participants, from the audience. No one's here. They left us alone. It's Saturday afternoon, so they left us alone. Okay, I will read the question for Alexianna, and we will wait. Maybe there are more. is from Charalambos Kouroundis. It is epistemologically safe and fruitful to examine concrete cases of party speeches, considering the fact that all parties have a double speech. Charalambos asks. I mean that we know, for example, that not only Syriza, but also the Communist Party had made very concrete proposals in the revisional parliament of 2006, anything but manichaeistic. We also know that Syriza has been divided between 1212 and 1215, with Katrougalos arguing for a constituent assembly and other party members and supporters disagreeing. We also know, Charalambos, this is a long question. We also know that the line which prevailed was that of a call for a revisional assembly. In a nutshell, I mean that it seems dangerous to me to take certain parties' positions and try to generalize, because they are very much rooted in time and to the concrete needs of the political struggle. Okay, he apologizes in any case because he was vaccinated in the morning. So Alexianna, I think he has a point there. So you have the floor to answer.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Yes, I agree that it is dangerous to generalize the position of some parties. But the goal of my study was not that. The categorization of my data regarding the party, the movement, was only a methodological tool. The goal of my study was not to generalize the position of a party and to say what this party says about the constitution or the populism. I wanted to study the populist rhetoric in a wide political spectrum. So I had to see texts from right-wing populism, left-wing populism, and to study as many instances as possible. So this categorization was only a methodological tool. However, in my paper, I present the data, I present details about my data, and the text was the presentation of the movement Independent Greeks in the website of the party, the presentation of the identity of the Pan-European movement DiEM25 in the website of the party, the statutory text of the Communist Party of Greece in the website of the party. So I think that these texts are representative of the position of the party. And we can say that what they say is what they think about the constitution. I agree that the article and the speech of George Katrougalos are not necessarily representative of Syriza. And that was a concern of mine in my study. But I wanted to study as many instances and texts possible to understand the populist rhetoric in a wide spectrum. So that's why I did it. But I think that most texts are very representative of what a party thinks about the constitution and the constitutional change.
Thank you, Alexianna. Costas Stratilatis has raised his hand. Costa?
A methodological point again. I wonder why, Alexianna, you didn't include in your sample speeches or other discursive elements of major parties in Greece. Why Syriza and ANEL and the Communist Party were pre-selected as populist ones? For example, you could select, I'm just mentioning an example, the speech of the former Prime Minister and Samaras in the parliament during the ratification of the Prespa agreement. It would be, I mean, and to compare, because supposedly all these other parties are not populist, but in reality, and what interests science, political science is a reality, we have to test our empirical against the supposedly other. This is what I believe should be the real test, to compare fragments of these parties with fragments from other parties, which are supposedly at the populist. And I think many big surprises are awaiting us when, if we do this comparison. Thank you.
Alexianna, if you want to answer, you can answer.
Of course. So you have, I agree with you, you have right. And initially, I have thought about that, that I could study more text from a wider political spectrum and to see many parties, such as PASOK or Nea Demokratia or whatever, to study their populist speeches. Yes, of course, they have populist speeches. But I wanted to study the populism regarding the constitutional change. So I didn't want to study only populism and the populist rhetoric. I want to show to see how the populism, what the populist rhetoric says about the constitution in order to study constitutional populism. So I have found this text. I have not pre-selected the parties. I have found this text that this text have or their main subject or an instance about the constitution and the need to change it or write a new constitution. And that I have not found it in texts and speeches of other parties. These were the only parties and movements that have a clear goal to change, to radically revise the constitution, to negatively characterize the current constitution of 1975, and the goal to radically revise it or change it or write a new one. So thank you,
Alexianna. I don't see any any other questions, so I'm going to ask. Because I can. I want to ask Aleksandra if you think that all these people coming in the streets, all these women coming in the streets against the decision of the Constitutional Court, if we consider a type of populist constitutionalism.
I'm not sure if I understood well your question. Could you repeat it?
If these demonstrations against a decision of the Constitutional Court, the authority to rule on the Constitution, if these demonstrations against this rule is a form of populist constitutionalism.
I understand. Definitely it is more, I would say, it has more in common with the idea of popular constitutionalism, definitely, because, or I would say also, I don't know, maybe societal constitutionalism, because this is the people. So, of course, I have to say that the Polish society is very divided. I would say it is politically divided, and well, there is a clash between one and the second group, and I wouldn't say easily that I don't know that there is an easy chance to win elections win next parliamentary elections. But for example, if you take out of the box such an ideological issue as abortion, then you usually have some unexpected results, I would say. And yes, I think that maybe this will, at least this one judgment will develop in something, I would say, useful, politically useful. And there are some political, how to say, the women movements are developing into more political forms. So we'll see. But I wouldn't say that it is simply the form of popular constitutionalism. It is, I would say, it has more in common with popular constitutionalism than giving the floor the captured constitutional court to declare something which is already foreseen, easily foreseen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry. If I may, because I don't know if there are any other questions, but if I have,
you can ask. There is a question in the chat, but you can ask. And
yeah, because if I'm on the microphone, then I would take the advantage of this. And I have a question to Alberto. It was a very interesting presentation, and I had one very detailed question, because in your approach you took three forms of, let's say, approach to constitutional review, and there were constitutional courts, and there was ordinary courts that do constitutional review or judicial review, and without constitutional review. And I wonder why you decided to give 0.5 to decentralized judicial review and 1 point to constitutional courts. I mean, are constitutional courts from, I don't know, they, simply they are always, let's say, less EU friendly, because, for example, the Belgian Constitutional Court or the Austrian Constitutional Court are usually described as very EU friendly ones. I don't know, there's of course the Netherlands with its, let's say, almost unique approach. I would say maybe Luxembourg is the other country with no constitutional supremacy, but I would say these are the constitutional oddities rather than a trend. So that's my question. Do you really consider the decentralized judicial review more EU friendly? Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksandra. Before you answer, Alberto, I give the floor to Juha. He has some questions in the chat.
Okay. So what are the limits for regulating populist manifestations on social media? So I think where we have, or what are, I wish I had an answer. My best answer is I don't think we have a particularly good answer yet. So I don't think most people who write about social media regulation are interested generally with populism in the way in which I'm interested in. So they like these extreme manifestations like Trump, or they're very focused on the US context, and things like misinformation. I think for misinformation, we can come up with pretty good ways of regulating it. And I think social media companies are doing something in that direction. Now, of course, it's all voluntary, which is a huge problem, because you have private companies who are wielding extremely powerful tools, and the way in which they regulate it is left up entirely to them. So the kind of regulations that you find in domestic law and international human rights law are relatively minimal. But I'll need to look into both those, all of these instances to see how Facebook justified it. But yeah, that's the best answer I can sort of give you. I think there is a bit of a red herring that people like to pull here about this being censorship. I mean, clearly it is not in the same way when a state stops you from saying certain things, prohibits publication of things. I mean, this just has to do with the actual terms and conditions of the particular platform that's being used. And then Nicola's question, So I think my focus is on European right-wing populism because they're the ones that I consider to be generally posing a threat to democracy. Doesn't mean it could not be expanded. I've written on populism in South Africa sometimes. So you could do that. I'd be hesitant to expand it too far. Because otherwise, I mean, this is the thing with populism is just, it captures so many things and then things are so different. So even when it comes to rhetoric, and maybe anti-elitist rhetoric is one of the few defining elements of all forms of populism. But even then, I'm hesitant. So, and the second question about whether I deal with the danger that certain measures related to militant democracy could be used by authoritarian governments so as to limit pluralism. Not this paper, but I am working on another one that deals with the costs of protecting democracy. So if we protect certain elements in democracy, what are the potential downsides? And there are some. In general, I would say that if you're one of those countries that can afford to have a militant democracy or tools of you probably don't need it. And if you need it, you can't have it. So this is one of those sort of bigger problems there. I think the ones where it is really problematic is sort of transitional governments, which tend to be a little bit less stable. So the new constitution may present options for or potential to capture institutions. We've seen party bans being used like this. So yeah, absolutely it is. It's one of these things, context matters. Thanks very much. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Alberto?
Yeah, thank you, Aleksandra, for your question. Yeah, indeed, my scoring is 0 to no constitutional review, 0.5 to decentralized constitutional review, and 1 to constitutional court. Important for my theoretical setting, the distinction between institutional potential and political practice. When you say about like a known Euro-friendly court, I consider that political practice. It can change. Judges can change, and they can change their attitude towards the EU. I look at indeed at law in the books, and I find that the question there, the indicator is the institutional capacity of courts to make antinomies between national law and the European law apparent and evident. And indeed, I think it is not surprised that the counter-limits doctrine, the Zolang doctrine, they all come from centralized constitutional courts, because the constitutional court says it's word once and it's valid all over, while in the centralized systems, it's not this decisive, like the way in which conflicts are apparent.
If I may, one more question. Because I don't know, maybe I missed, but I think that quite an important factor, institutional factor, but also maybe important for constitutional practice is, in my opinion, federalism. I don't know if it would be also, because if when I analyze constitutional practice of federal states, they usually, understand better the EU issues with multi-level governance and so on, rather than the countries that they are not federal. Of course, it is not always true, but I would say that there is something.
It is definitely true. Like I find it also in my vision. For instance, I consider, let's take the case of where I am in Belgium. for the ratification of EU treaties, there is a veto power of subnational entities. And yeah, it is a very peculiar federation, the Belgian one, because not only like territorial entities like the regions, but also like linguistic, cultural entities like the German-speaking community, which represents 1% of a country, which is already small, can veto the ratification for all the federation, the ratification of the treaties. And this is my understanding, my setting is a very strong point towards, strong element which points towards legitimacy. But in general, when I think about here for the purpose of the discussion and of the paper, which is more focused on populism, I just took into account parliamentary oversight and referendums, but parliamentary oversight itself is involved in the distinction with federations, because indeed, for instance, when the Belgian state discusses EU draft legislation at the Council of Ministers, if they are going to discuss something that will involve subnational entities, they conduct independently the parliamentary oversight. So we have 6 parliaments here, and they are all involved in the oversight of the executives in EU affairs. And I do take that into account in my analysis. But it's definitely true, what you just said.
Okay, thank you all. I think we have no more questions. I want to thank all panelists for your presentations, and you really honored us with your generosity to share your hard work with us. I would also like to thank all participants for the lively discussion we had, and I'd like to close this conference wishing that in another time, in another place, not virtually, we will be meeting again, and we will be drinking beers as supposed in the chat. Thank you again all. You have a nice Saturday night. Thank you.
Juha has something to say on that. He asked to say something.
Yeah, only cheers. Cheers.
Okay. Do I have the privilege of closing?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. It will only take a minute. So, after an exhausting day, I believe a very fruitful day, and after an exhausting 2 days conference, I want to dearly thank each and every one of you for your participation. I want to thank all panelists for presenting superb papers. Certainly our 3 distinguished keynote speakers, Antoine Vauchez, Bojan Bugarec, and Costas Douzinas, all chairpersons for keeping up with a very tight schedule. All members of the audience for staying with us and for excellent questions and comments. Also our friends from the Project U company for their technical support. One announcement, in due time all panelists will receive the video of our conference, and you will also receive follow-up for the publication. And we're also planning a second conference for next spring and a third one in spring 2023. You are all invited to join them. And before closing, allow me to thank the members of the PopCon team and the PopCon network for doing an excellent job in organizing this conference. Dr. Eleni Lapa, Dr. Nicolas Vagdoutis, Dr. Haris Hugh, PhD candidates Michalis Mitas and Jason Koutufaris Malandrinos, the members of the organizing committee, Dr. Eleni Kalambakou from our university law school, and Professors Christos Papastylianos and Costas Stratilatis from the University of Nicosia Law School. Last but not least, Professor Ifigenia Kamtsidou from our law school, who has been in many ways the heart and soul of this conference. Thanks to everybody. I wish you all the best. Stay healthy. And as I said, this is an au revoir and not an adieu. Bye to everybody.
Bye. Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you all. And yes, we'll definitely wish to meet in person very soon, very soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.